It really is straightforward. Are we going to uphold international human rights law or are we not?
Welcome to the ReThinkDesi Reframe series, where we challenge conventional narratives about social change, sustainability, and the South Asian community. Join me, your host, Arpita Sharma, each week as I have candid conversations with thought leaders, social entrepreneurs, researchers, activists, and creatives as we uncover the strategies, innovations, and stories behind their efforts to reshape our society. I'm Arpita Sharma, your host, and today we have the privilege of speaking with Qasim Rashid, a human rights lawyer, an author, and a former congressional candidate. He has published multiple peer-reviewed works of scholarship, is a children's book author, and is on season 3 of the Qasim Rashid Show on SiriusXM. Qasim has been published and featured on the New York Times, NPR, BBC, Guardian, and the Washington Post, amongst others. Qasim sits on the boards of numerous human rights nonprofits and is a National Security Fellow for the Truman Project. Qasim's insights into his journey from growing up in Section 8 housing to his current role as a prominent advocate for justice and equality are inspiring and motivational. So throughout our conversation today, Qasim shares the pivotal moments from his childhood and his legal career that shaped his commitment to serving humanity and advocating for marginalized communities. We'll explore his motivations for dedicating his career to causes such as supporting survivors of domestic violence and asylum seekers, drawing from his personal experience as an immigrant and someone who grew up in a low-income household. So Qasim offers valuable perspectives on necessary reforms to create a more equitable legal system, and his approach to understanding the current horrifying situation in Gaza and what the U.S. can do to help resolve the situation. So let's jump in. So you've had an incredible journey from growing up in Section 8 housing to becoming a prominent human rights lawyer, and now having also run for Congress. What has motivated you to pursue a career in law and public service?
Well, I think part of it comes down to my immigrant experience as well. And, recognizing that Asian communities, South Asian communities don't really have the kind of history in the United States as other communities, good or bad. Due to anti-immigrant rhetoric and the bans on Asian immigration, our communities didn't really start immigrating here until the mid to late 1960s, because Black civil rights leaders ensured that Asians would have the right to immigrate with the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1964. And so for me, understanding the power of the law and understanding how our communities are vehemently underrepresented was one of the big driving factors, especially in a post 9/11 America. I mean, I was a 19-year-old sophomore in college when 9/11 happened. And immediately I went from being, a random person to being the spokesperson for all people, Muslim and bearded. And, it was a very interesting, to say the least, experience. And when we look at the 20 plus years since then, I think in many respects, we've gone backwards. The rise of white supremacist violence, of Islamophobic hate crimes, anti-Asian hate crimes. And so it's important to me that we have representation, that we are at the forefront of these conversations and making sure that our communities are represented, not just for ourselves, but for the future of this country, for the future generations of our communities as well.
Thank you for sharing that. I think 9/11 has played a huge role in a lot of people's lives, a lot of South Asians' lives as in the United States. And so grateful for all of the work that you have done, really in terms of human rights over the lifetime of your work. Can you share a pivotal moment or experience from your childhood or early career that really shaped your commitment to serving humanity and advocating for justice?
I don't think I can ever say that I've, become some champion for human rights. I mean, we can all do our best, but you'll never hear me say that, look at me now, look at how good I am. I think that's not appropriate for anyone to say about themselves. I certainly won't. What I will say is that in my formative years, I did experience firsthand the importance of representation. One story I often tell is, I think this must have been around 1990 or so. I was about 8 years old. And back in the day, before cell phones, before the internet, you had your answering machine that people would call and leave messages on. And I remember coming home one night, we were out at some, I don't know if we were at someone's home or where we were. I remember coming home and my father going to his office and checking the answering machine. And this just monsoon of Islamophobic bigotry came out of somebody who was, cursing at us because we were Muslim. And I recall the look of hurt in my father's eye. It wasn't for him. I realized this years later. It wasn't for him. It was that his son had to experience that at an age of 8. And, you fast forward, I don't know, almost 30 years later, and the FBI shows up at my door because there's been a credible death threat made against me, and they need me to testify against the person who threatened to kill me. And so my mind flashed back to that 8-year-old kid who was now, I was 30, 36, 37 at the time, thinking to myself that, what has really changed in a generation and a half, 3 decades, what's really changed? And, there's a number of other events that I can tie and point to that all speak to this critical issue that representation matters. We need to be at the forefront. We need to lean into these conversations and establish our boundaries, not as a resistance, but as an affirmation of how we can engage in a positive and productive way. And growing up low income, recognizing the need of just basic necessities, food, water, shelter, healthcare, education, clothing. I'm not talking about extravagance. I'm talking about the basic necessities to get by, and recognizing that we don't live at a time of scarcity. We live at a time of excessive greed. And the role each of us need to play is to ensure that when it comes to these issues of human rights, whatever someone's faith or background or whatever differentiating factor is important, but still secondary to the basic humanity that every person has inherent within them. And I think it's that recognition from a very early age that has kind of been my driving force in the work that I do and that I continue to do.
I've been a fan of your work for some time, and I think part of the reason is because when I came to the United States, my brother had a terminal illness, and my parents worked as cashiers at the gas station in order to support us. And I think often when we hear about South Asian Americans or Asian Americans in the media, because of like this model minority myth, we often really don't hear those stories of struggle. Or if we do, it's seen in the light of, their children have gone on to do so many amazing things, but it often doesn't really address the struggle that those communities are facing in that moment. And I really appreciate you and the work you do to bring light to a lot of those struggles, because they're very important. And as much as we can do in order to improve people's quality of life when they are coming to the U.S. or across the globe, as we are struggling as a human species to be able to grow, it really speaks to the human heart and this desire for this change to happen. You actually tend to focus a lot around advocating for survivors of domestic violence, asylum seekers, marginalized communities. I'd love to hear kind of what has inspired you to dedicate your career to these kind of particular causes.
I mean, I think it kind of goes back to the point I was making earlier that these basic core elements of food, water, shelter, healthcare, education, clothing. I go to these 6 things often, that we all need to ensure we build a society where these things are guaranteed their inherent rights. And, something like domestic violence, I've been working in this space now for about 15 years. I've had, hundreds of clients. And the one thing that's consistent in every single circumstance is, well, in this case, men are the root cause of the domestic violence, right? Men need to do better. My clients, some of them are Muslim women, some of them are Christian, some of them are atheists, some are Jewish, some are Hindu, some are wealthy, some are low income. It's like a universal hypocrisy of men to engage in this kind of violence against women. And even the phrase we use, violence against women, right? We remove men from the equation altogether. Like this magical violence is just falling upon women from the sky. And so for me, that is kind of a core in how we build a stronger society, ultimately. But then beyond that, right, asylum seekers, I mean, this is, again, a kind of a core principle of humanity. I saw this funny TikTok of a guy taking like a blue pen like this and drawing a circle around an ant. And the ant is approaching where the ink is and then turning and going the other direction. And he makes a comment like, look at how dumb this ant is. He's bound by this magical line that doesn't actually exist. And then he pans out to a map of the world, and you recognize that these are all arbitrary lines that we've drawn. And that's not to say that nations don't matter or borders don't matter. It is to say that they shouldn't matter more than the basic humanity of people seeking asylum. And I've represented asylum seekers, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal, worked with about 50 different families to get them here safely, have done religious freedom asylum cases. And again, the fact that we're even debating whether we should protect asylum as a human right is mortifying to me, because people forget why we established asylum as a human right. One of the big reasons was the Holocaust and the recognition that, for example, the SS St. Louis was turned away carrying Jewish refugees, and about 250 of them were then murdered in the Holocaust because our government turned them away. And so for us to forget that lesson of history and to revive that it's mortifying, it's horrifying, and it's hypocritical, it's racist, every description you want to give to it. And I see my role as someone who has been fortunate and extraordinarily lucky to be able to build a skill set as an attorney to provide support in this space. I absolutely should take every opportunity to do so.
It can be extremely difficult when you're in those types of vulnerable situations to find and be able to advocate for yourself. And so it's the value of having laws and lawyers who are set up really to engaging people and to supporting their cases when they're in those types of situations is extremely important. I would love to draw back to some of the experiences you shared earlier of growing up as an immigrant, and particularly as a South Asian immigrant, and growing up in a low-income household, and dig into how has that shaped your approach to legal advocacy and kind of the work that you want to do around policymaking?
It's a good question. I think, when I was in law school 15, 16 years ago, the explosion of South Asian attorneys, Muslim attorneys, Arab attorneys of color in general, there's a seismic shift, and it's exciting to see. It's exciting to see, people who graduated law school a decade after I did on partner track. And I mean, I love it. That wasn't the track I chose because I can't stand, the billable hours requirement and whatnot and the rat race, but it's exciting to see them be successful. So, what I think about is I'm not going to ever profess to be the smartest person in the room. What I think about is I've been down a road that a lot of people are trying to walk down right now. And if I can provide support by saying, hey, heads up, there's a pothole at mile 2, or there's a crash at mile 6, or you may want to take this detour at mile 7, then that can be the value add I provide. And in doing so, opening the doors and opening access to more people who otherwise would have fallen down that pothole or would have been stopped by that crash or would have been, not rerouted effectively. That's kind of the role that I see that I can play in this space. That what can I do to make the road easier for the next generation coming up? And so, like, one of the things I love doing is when a young lawyer reaches out with questions or thoughts, I'm always happy to have the conversation with them. When a young South Asian person in particular, young people in general, but it's always great when you see people from your community coming together, reaches out. I mean, I think we connected a couple of days ago and we're already having the conversation. So I do as much as I can to be accessible and available, because I know that if I've accomplished anything, and I don't think I've accomplished much yet, but if I have accomplished anything, it's due to the fact that people were generous with their time, with their money, with their wisdom, and elevated me and my platform to where it is now. And if I can pay it forward and continue to be a conduit for the next generation, then it's not just my privilege and obligation, but my honor to do that. And hopefully it can make a difference long term as well as in the short term.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, both personally and I think at a larger level. Oftentimes, we like when South Asian immigrants are coming to the U.S. or even kind of in their home countries, there's a lot of struggle that's present, and there's because of our history of colonialism and the political atmosphere, it can make it really difficult to be able to access those resources and connections,
Sure.
and really to build up and feel like you have the role models and the support systems in order to be able to accomplish your dreams in life. And so thank you for sharing that, because I think there's a lot of value in having that mentorship and having that support. Here you are as someone who is a pillar in our community doing that. The desire to achieve big dreams is great, but from someone who is like watching you from here, I appreciate how much you have been able to do and the amount of the experience that you've built over that period of time.
Well, thank you.
So you've seen how our country's laws and systems unfairly work for those who have money and power. And I'd love to get your perspective on what specific reforms do you believe are necessary in order to create a more equitable legal system?
Well, money is a big part of it. And, there's a reason why someone like, Donald Trump has avoided prison, has avoided accountability for a lot of the crimes he's committed, whereas all of his associates have all been imprisoned. There's a reason why someone like Crystal Mason, the black woman in Texas, who filed a provisional ballot on the advice of a poll worker, had to go through 6 years of torture to stay out of prison, whereas a white male judge in the same county, Torrance County, Texas, committed election fraud repeatedly and got probation and a small fine. And it's money, it's access, it's also representation. One of my favorite authors, Mary Robin Cowell, she's a sci-fi author. She has a brilliant quote where she says, "It's not diversity for the sake of diversity, it's representation for the sake of reality." And so one of the things that needs to happen is we need more people from our communities in positions of leadership and in positions of power, without forgetting our roots and our backgrounds as well. You mentioned the model minority aspect of it. I mean, one of the frustrating things was that the repeal of affirmative action was on the backs of Asian students who allowed themselves to be hijacked by white supremacists to pass a Supreme Court decision that's destructive to anyone who's not a white male. And in fact, destructive to white males as well. It's just destructive to all of us. And it was to appease a very small white male, white supremacist minority. So representation is a critical part of it. Two, look, investing resources, right? Those, the South Asian community, yes, there's a certain significant portion of us who are low income and struggling and new and driving Ubers and getting by. And those are honorable jobs. Let me be clear about that. And there's also a significant chunk of South Asians who are exceedingly wealthy, right? That have the resources, that have done extraordinarily well for themselves, whether they're, businessmen and women, whether they're entrepreneurs, whether they're physicians, whether they're engineers. Our communities have done really well. And so investing those resources in the younger generation, in candidates for office, in candidates who, even if they're not from our community, but they align with our values, I think it's an obligation. There has to be a financial component of this. And then I think the final part of it is the wisdom aspect of it, right? So there's, first thing I mentioned was, the representation doing the work. Second part is the wealth. And third part is the wisdom aspect of it. That those who have kind of been to the promised land of success, whether they're a CEO or elected, bring 5 people along with you, bring 10 people along with you. And there's no Thanos snap. There's no Thanos snap that's going to solve everything overnight. But if we're consistent, then over 10 years, over a generation, we can see meaningful and seismic shift and create a better future for our country, for our communities as well. Those are kind of the 3 broad brushstrokes that I would paint that, regardless of whether you're an introvert or an outrovert, regardless of whether you have high education or low education, regardless of whether you're wealthy or low income, there's a role you can play, a meaningful, consequential role you can play. And I would encourage everyone to do whatever's within their capacity to get started.
Has there been a memorable moment or experience or case from your legal career that has had a profound impact on you, either personally or professionally?
There's many, but I think the one that I often think about is the very first pro bono case I ever had of a DV survivor, a woman who was here on a temporary fiance visa, was suffering horrific abuse. And I remember the day the whole process took, I want to say, a year and a half, almost 2 years. And the day we drove to her final immigration hearing before the judge, and the judge granted her an independent visa and asylum, allowing her to be free. And just the look of relief and the catharsis that she had was priceless. I mean, it was incredible. For me, it was the first actual client I had that I was able to represent somebody who had been denied justice and get them access to something that we all take for granted, right? I mean, documented status, so many people take it for granted. And it's such a priceless gift, right? It's such a precious gift. And here was a young woman who now not only was able to get out of an extraordinarily abusive situation, but now have her own independent autonomy and ability to succeed. And then over the years, watching her go to nursing school and become, a nurse and become a professional and, live her life, live her best life, triggered by the fact that she could finally be independent financially, practically. That's something I think about often, because for her, it was that. For somebody else, it's making sure I have enough money to put food on the table for my kid, right? We're talking about, do I want to upgrade this car for $2,000 to get the leather seats? $2,000 is, 2 months of groceries for this family. For somebody else, it could be, how do I pay for my daughter's medication for this chronic disease that she has, and providing access. I mean, so for me, those are the moments that I think about it. And I try to keep them individualistic in the sense that I don't want to get lost in the, I've helped this many clients and this is, that to me is secondary. It's, like I mentioned, the 50-ish Afghan families, like I remember speaking to each of those families, and just the joy when they realize that they're going to be able to get access was a powerful thing. And so that to me, those will always be the catharsis. Those will always be, the opportunities where I am just grateful that we're able to move the ball in the right direction. And simultaneously, I always see it as insufficient. Like there's more we got to do. There's so much more work. We have so little time to get it done. But it just speaks to the need to work with a sense of urgency, because, you always feel like time is running out.
Even in my own kind of family and friend circle, this struggle with like issues around domestic violence, and the fears around visa and immigration status have such a profound impact on people's lives. Thank you for sharing that, because really as an immigration lawyer, you actually had a profound impact on someone's like ability to be able to live and function in the US. So I want to create a space for us to also be able to talk about something that has been in topic of conversation on the news for some time, and really is also having a huge impact on so many people's lives across the world, which is the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so this conflict is one of, the most contentious and longstanding issues in international relations. And as someone who advocates for human rights, I'd love to know, how do you approach understanding and addressing the complexities of this conflict?
I fundamentally reject that it's a complex conflict. I think that's a phrase that is often thrown around in media. I want to be careful not to slam your question. I think it's an important question to ask, because I think that the blunt questions are the ones to ask. But I fundamentally reject the premise that it's a complex conflict. This is a very simple conflict. You have the state of Israel created in 1948. You have mass displacement of Palestinians, and you have an agreement by 1967 of a two-state solution. And since then, you have one party, the Palestinians, who have remained occupied, and another party, the Israelis, who have been doing the occupying. There are clear terms of engagement in international human rights law of what an occupier is responsible for and how an occupied people can resist occupation as well. And I put out this post on Instagram and TikTok, and I didn't get, and it got thousands of engagements, thousands of comments, not a single actual response to a very simple question. International human rights law is clear that taking land is illegal. We are supporting Ukraine right now because Russia is illegally taking Ukrainian land. How is it any different when Israel is illegally taking Palestinian land? Show me the distinction. Why is one considered to be freedom fighters and the other is considered to be terrorists? Why is one considered to be a just cause and the other considered to be unjust? And so where I fundamentally ask people to be accountable to in this question is, what we're seeing happening in Palestine. And I've been to Israel. I've been to occupied Palestine. I've seen South Hebron. I've seen Ramallah. I've seen Jerusalem. And I've seen this with my own eyes. I've been stopped. I was stopped at gunpoint 5 separate times by IDF, forced to show my papers under threat of arrest. I was forced off a bus at gunpoint. And so I've seen this happen. And this is me as an attorney, as a U.S. citizen, somebody who knows my rights. And imagine what's being done to Palestinians who have no rights, no authority over there. So for me, it's a very simple equation. Does Israel recognize the right of Palestinians to have a state of their own? And everything we've seen from the Israeli government, from Netanyahu, is that they don't. They fundamentally don't. And so then the question is, what are Palestinians allowed to do? Because they had the Great March of Return in 2018, and dozens were killed, hundreds were injured. There's no accountability. They've tried the boycott, divest, and sanction movement, the BDS movement, and 40 states have criminalized it as illegal. They withstood. People often say, well, October 6th, there was a ceasefire and Hamas broke it. I'm not here to defend Hamas. I don't like Hamas. I've condemned Hamas from day one. I have zero regard for violence against civilians. And I won't ever be baited into defending them. What I will say is in the West Bank, where there is no Hamas, from January 1st to October 6th of last year, more than 200 Palestinian civilians were killed by the IDF. In the first 10 months of last year, more than 800 Palestinian children were arrested and indefinitely detained by the Israeli military. The Bat Salim, an Israeli human rights organization, and Save the Children and UNICEF all report that these children are being held indefinitely, without legal counsel, without access to parents. 70+% report physical abuse, including gunshot wounds and broken bones, and more than 20% report sexual abuse. Now you tell me, if a government if some power, if some authority, some military takes your children, physically and sexually abuses them, denies them access to legal counsel and parents, what word would you use to describe that other than hostage? And so for me, I, as a human rights lawyer, I don't have the capacity to pull punches and to sugarcoat stuff. This is wrong. It's immoral. It was wrong and immoral when Hamas attacked civilians. It's wrong and immoral when Israel is attacking civilians and taking land that isn't theirs. And so the solution to this is international human rights law, where you have clearly defined borders, where we have an end to the settlements, an end to the occupation, an end to the blockade, free movement, or based off a visa process. So there is obviously, so it's documented. But you cannot pretend that this violence we're seeing began on October 7th. It's been going on for decades and decades and decades. And the fact that it finally got your attention on October 7th, to the people who think it just started then, shame on you for ignoring the decades before then, where there was ongoing injustices and atrocities. And to me, the safety and security of Israel and Palestine is dependent upon upholding international human rights law and ensuring that there's equal access to justice for both parties. And that has to be the path forward. And that comes by defining the borders, defining the 1967 borders that have been internationally agreed upon, removing the illegal settlements, removing the occupation, and ensuring that there's autonomy and self-determination for both peoples.
Digging into this a little bit in terms of the role that you believe the United States should play in resolving conflict, both diplomatically and in terms of policy.
Well, we need to be just arbiters, and part of that requires us to be fair in how we're dealing. It doesn't make any sense that we're giving another $20 billion in military aid to Israel while cutting off UNRWA funding for Palestine. Right? It doesn't make any sense that we condemn Russia for taking Ukrainian land and then defend Israel for taking Palestinian land. That's not being just. It doesn't make any sense that we sit on the UN Security Council and continue to veto any resolution that holds Israel accountable to international human rights law. And so we need to be just arbiters. If we want to be the shining city on the hill, if we want to be the vanguard of an international rules-based order, if we want to be seen as a world leader in diplomacy and integrity and in honesty, here is a prime example for us to demonstrate that. The fact that our government has sat idle, rather enabled through ongoing arms sales and transfers, more than 33,000 Palestinian civilian deaths, bombings, nearly 14,000 of whom are innocent children, is an outrage. It's an absolute outrage. And the role that the U.S. government must play has to be one of upholding justice. Otherwise, they're enabling ongoing violence. And if this war, this siege on Gaza escalates, then you can point to the fact that our government continued to allow arms sales in violation of the Leahy laws. The Leahy laws are restrictions on the Department of Defense and the State Department of transferring arms to countries when we have credible evidence of human rights violations. And we have ample credible evidence of human rights violations. The New York Times did, and as right-wing as the New York Times is, even they brought out visual evidence of more than 200 times where the IDF told Palestinians, go to this safe zone where we will not bomb. And then they bombed that safe zone. That's a de facto violation of international human rights law. You don't get to tell a civilian to go to the spot for safety and then bomb that spot. It's an outrage. And knowing that, the fact that the U.S. government continues to sell arms and that politicians continue to look the other way, it's disgusting. It's shameful. And it is a complete violation of human dignity and integrity. So the role the U.S. must play has to be to uphold justice. Otherwise, we're enabling more violence. And that, to me, is just unacceptable.
Thank you. I think there's been so many people, close to me who've shared those similar concerns, and it's just so nice to hear it from a human rights lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. That's why I go back to your point earlier about this complex situation. It's really not that complex. It really is straightforward. Are we going to uphold international human rights law, or are we not? If we are, let's uphold it. Let's apply it. The ICJ with the South Africa lawsuit put forth an excellent case. And the fact that the U.S. government is preventing the Palestinian Authority from going to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, who has enforcement authority, is again wild to me, right? The fact that Israel won't allow foreign journalists to report is just wild. It's incredible to me. And again, what we saw happen with the World Central Kitchen massacre. Again, the fact that when 6 white people were killed, now there's outrage. Again, it's such a clear as day example of the double standards being put forth. And I'm glad. Look, Chef Andres does incredible work. I'm glad that people paid attention finally after the World Central Kitchen massacre, but it shouldn't have taken that. The first 33,000 civilians killed should have been enough. The first 1,000, the first one killed should have been enough. But again, I want the listeners to think about this. And there's some great books. The 100 Years War in Palestine is a great book about this as well, that really recognizes that this is not as complex as that's an attempt to convince you that you need to have a PhD in Middle East geopolitics to understand what's going on. You don't. You just need to read the books by the scholars in this space and understand by recognizing. I mean, even read the ICJ report, and you'll have a very clear understanding of how lopsided this is.
So, kind of given the recent escalations and violence in the region, what actions do you believe are necessary to de-escalate tensions and work towards a sustainable peace agreement?
Immediate ceasefire, unconditional release of all hostages, end the arms trade, end to the settlements, end to the occupation, end to the blockade, and massive international investment to rebuild Gaza. In that order. I mean, that's just what needs to happen. And some of those things can be done simultaneously, but it all starts with the ceasefire. And look, every war in the history of humanity ended in a ceasefire. Every single one. So this siege on Gaza will end in a ceasefire eventually, right? It just has to. It's not going to go on until the year 3000, right? So the question is, are we going to wait and bleed out every single innocent person possible, or are we going to recognize this is not helping? Let's engage in a ceasefire now. And if your issue is hostages, good. Mine is too. And guess what? 3 hostages have been released during bombing. 130 were released during ceasefire. So if you truly care about hostages, then let's engage in a ceasefire and demand an unconditional release of all hostages. You know, the UN Security Council passed a resolution that the U.S. abstained voting on, demanding an end to the bombing and a release of hostages, and Israel kept bombing. Where's the accountability? So I think, again, the path is very clear: ceasefire, unconditional release of all hostages, and the occupation and the settlements and the blockade, and then rebuild Gaza and ensure there's a meaningful 2-state solution.
So I'd like to end on one last question. Would you have any guidance that you'd like to offer those in the audience who are looking to have a career in human rights law or kind of do any sort of humanitarian work in their future?
Read relationships and consistency. Those are 3 things. 1, read everything under the sun. Look up the scholars that you admire, read their books, read their law review articles, and understand the context of the issue that you're fighting for. You're not going to boil the ocean. You're not going to solve every single human rights issue in the world, but you don't need to. Find the 1 or 2 that matter the most to you and read everything you can about that issue. Because what's going to happen is, let's say your issue is curing AIDS, right? It's a pretty important issue. That doesn't mean you don't care about curing cancer. It just means that curing AIDS is your thing, right? Become the expert on that. Become the scholar on that. Become the premier thought leader on that. Because then you're going to draw other people who are going to say, I'm an expert on curing cancer, but I need an expert on AIDS. Let me go to this person who's clearly the expert. And that synergy is going to help. So while it's tempting to want to solve every problem in the world, find the 1 or 2 that matter the most and become the expert. 2, relationships. Look up the people who are the thought leaders and send them a note and say, hey, my name is Qasim. I want to be a human rights lawyer. I'm just starting out. I'm still in high school. I'm still in college. I haven't taken the LSAT. I'm a first-year law student. I just graduated law school. Wherever your stage is, and say, I would love just to have a 30-minute Zoom with you. Or if you're in their city, I would love to get together and just buy you a cup of coffee and just pick your brain. And the thing is, there's a pretty good chance they'll respond and say, yeah, I'd love to. Especially if they have a book and you say, hey, I read your book. I was just enamored by it. And I would love to sit down and chat with you about the book. Trust me, there's nothing authors love more than talking about the books that they wrote. And so find a different person every week. And it sounds like a lot, but I'm telling you, these industries are small worlds. If in a year you talk to 50 scholars in an industry, you've probably talked to the top 50 scholars in that industry. And that consistency is a third part of it. That consistency is going to come back tenfold. Because when they're looking to hire the next person, when they're looking to partner with the next person, they talk to each other. And they're going to say, you know what, I remember speaking to this young woman. She's got a podcast. She talks about stuff a lot. Yeah, I talked to her as well. And so it's going to help you become kind of in the inner circle in this space as well. And look, none of that costs money, right? Yeah, sure, you buy a book here, buy a cup of coffee there, but you don't need to have thousands of dollars. Just start reading, build those relationships, and then be consistent about it. And opportunities will present themselves, and you'll be able to land the right opportunities sooner or later. But it happens by you taking the initiative and jumping in headfirst.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.